Ja, ďakujem veľmi pekne pánu Slosiarikovi za veľmi zaujímavý vstup. Teraz bude pokračovať pán Christof Zellenberg a potom bude priestor na diskusiu. Počítali sme, nebojte sa, neukrátime o diskusiu. Ak ešte možno predtým chcem upozorniť, pán Christof Zellenberg bude prednášať v angličtine, takže možno pre tých, ktorí neovládate tak dobre anglicky, aby ste mohli plynule rozumieť, prosím vás, zoberte si sluchátka, vzadu sú pri našich asistentkách a môžeme pokračovať.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed that you invited me to come over at your esteemed conference. Unfortunately, I have to tell the audience that the organizers made a substantial and big mistake inviting me, because I'm absolutely incompetent talking about families. I'm not married myself and I have no children. So, not yet, you say. So there is still hope in the first row for me. Thank you. But anyways, I try to do my best still to add some value to your conference. And I totally agree with what the lady in the second row here said before. Family is definitely not only and not even mostly about economics. Family is a lot more than an economic question. And thank you. And I will try to set what I'm going to say about the family in the larger context of Christian anthropology or the view of our society from a Christian perspective. Anyways, maybe at some points you will ask yourself, why is he telling us this or that during his lecture? But in the range of the lecture, you will understand that this all fits together. So let us start by saying very generally that the institution of the traditional family, as it is called nowadays, and I'm opposed to that, in fact, because it was suggested there is something else than the traditional family, which is one man and one woman getting married and becoming children. And I say that this is the only form of family. Everything else is something different forms of cohabitation. So therefore I actually object calling it the traditional family, but that's how society is calling it nowadays. So the institution of the family is of utmost importance for our society. The family is indeed the nucleus of our society and the highest representation of the true nature of the human being. Healthy families are responsible for a healthy society and a strong economic development. Above all, the economy is the interaction and cooperation of human beings in order to achieve their aims, needs, and wishes according to their individual preferences and their values, based on a system of give and take, in other words, a system of mutually beneficial exchange. This is also why we should not be afraid talking about the economy nevertheless, even so that's not everything what family is about, but the economy is totally integrated in our human society. It's nothing outside human society, some dangerous and strange beast that we need to control and tame or that we need to be afraid of. And we will see what the magisterium of the church is saying about the economy in a few minutes. Anyways, a society with strong family ties, and this is of utmost importance, needs less welfare state intervention, less government regulation and taxation, and thus brings about more individual freedom, more growth and prosperity, and more wealth creation. So this is why family is so important within our society. But today, there is a huge confusion about marriage. Divorce rates, we have seen, are soaring. Numbers of children born out of wedlock, out of marriage, are soaring as well. Poverty rates among families, but especially amongst single-parent households, are skyrocketing. The right to having a child instead of regarding children as undeserved gifts, and all the related questions of in vitro fertilization, pre-implantation diagnostics, but also embryonic stem cell research are pressing in our society. Our responsibility for the integrity of our body and the sacred dimension of our sexuality, but instead we are doing away with the result of our fun. We are having abortions, which was just mentioned before, or the whole concept of contraception that disconnects love from responsibility. We can talk about the gender ideology as opposed to a healthy view and understanding of the natural differences between the natural differences and the mutual complementation of male and female. Different, as I just mentioned, alternative forms of marriage or cohabitation. And last but not least, the whole LGBTY policies, but also policies of super early sex education already at kindergarten level. And this is a big discussion that is currently going on in Austria, where our politics, our Minister for Education is pressing for sex education at kindergarten levels. Can you imagine? How crazy is that? Anyways, in this lecture I will outline the positive contributions of families to our culture, our moral standards within our society, our productivity and thus our economic growth and wealth creation. I will touch on the so-called population dividend within growing societies, or reversely, and this is what we are caught in here in Europe, the economic drawbacks from shrinking and aging populations. And I will touch on the negative effects of our welfare state systems on our demographics and therefore on the population dividend. Just very briefly, because I mentioned before freedom, we will mention freedom to choose, our individual freedom, which entitles us to become responsible human beings, which is a constitutive element of our human nature. The current political and welfare system is a direct threat to our freedom. But directly linked with our freedom is the need to search for the truth and always uphold it in order to use our freedom properly and in a responsible manner. So let's just very briefly have a little flashlight on freedom. Freedom is the very basis, the very substance of our life as human beings. And the freedom to choose is the utmost important prerequisite of a free society and a free market system, and thus the driver of any wealth creation and a strong economic development. Our cardinal in Austria, Cardinal Schönborn, a year ago during a conference in Rome said, quote, "Our freedom is God's greatest gift to mankind." And I want to give you one quote which I always give during each one of my lectures, no matter what the lecture is about. So you also have to hear it now, but this is one of the most important quotes that I've ever heard in my life. And if you take home nothing but this one quote, then you already gained something. Because the saint Pope John Paul II once said about freedom, he said, "Imagine we would live in a world in which everyone would do good." Perfect world, isn't it? Everyone is doing good. Then he goes on, but not because he or she deliberately decides to do so, but because we are forced to do so. Then such a world would be a lot closer to hell than to heaven. That's a very important sentence. So this underlines how important the freedom to choose is. In Caritas in Veritate, Pope Benedict XVI says, only when it is free can development be integrally human. Only in a climate of responsible freedom can it grow in a satisfactory manner. But now we can ask ourselves, in light of our overboarding and heavily indebted welfare states, our close to confiscatory tax regimes that hinder wealth creation and reduces economic growth, and the ever-growing regulations, we need to ask ourselves whether we already crossed the line into a world that is not good anymore. We'll get back to that a little bit later. And now truth, freedom without truth cannot exist, cannot prevail. In his encyclical Caritas in Veritate, Pope Benedict says, fidelity to man requires fidelity to the truth, which alone is the guarantee of freedom and of the possibility of integral human development. But today, within our society, within many discussions, we are questioning whether truth as such exists at all, or whether we are living in an environment of mere subjective opinion. If that would be the case, then events like this one would be absolutely useless, because then you might be entertained to listen to what I have to say or he had to say, but it's nothing else than our subjective opinion, and everyone has a different opinion. There is no such thing like truth, so we cannot learn anything from this, and we will go home and gain nothing. Or is there truth? Are there facts that are undeniable? And this is what the Church upholds. Pope Leo XIII, already in the 19th century, said that it is our severe moral obligation to long for the truth and always uphold it in order to use our freedom properly. In other words, not all that I can freely choose to do would be good, proper, honest, and true, and should therefore be done. Therefore, the search for truth is the indispensable prerequisite for the proper use of our freedom, and in this sense, for any human action. But now, again, let's turn the position here. If we are thinking about truth, let's ask ourselves, for example, about the new gender ideology that tries to convince us that our sex is merely a social construction, but not a reality. Today I might feel like a man. Tomorrow I might want to be a woman. And due to the fact there is also within the LGBTY ideology the Y at the end, which is the intersex, maybe I'm changing. In the morning I'm a man, in the afternoon I'm a woman, and during lunchtime I'm undecided. But this is the whole gender ideology. Is that truth, or is it just crazy? By the way, if you want to pass whatever thesis at any university in Austria, the thesis needs to be gendered. You cannot write any normal thesis anymore. You need to write it in a gendered way. Or the different concepts of marriage and family, which are finally only aiming at destroying what we are now calling traditional family. Let us ask ourselves about how honest it is to lament about our, as we've just seen, population decline. And I'm shocked if it's true that here in Slovakia, the reproduction rate, the fertility rate is already only 1.1, which 1.3, I've seen on the chart 1.1. So it's 1.3, but even 1.3 would be below the Italian rate with 1.38, which I thought is the lowest in Europe. But obviously Slovakia is even lower, which is a total catastrophe. You're committing suicide. And we are committing suicide. Society is suicide. So let us ask how honest it is to lament about this population decline and the demographic disaster we are facing, at least within the so-called old world, and thus the nearing collapse of our welfare state systems. But at the same time, divorce rates are soaring, we are a contracepting society, and we are aborting hundreds of thousands of babies. Aborting. I would even go as far, and please don't stone me for that, but I would say murdering hundreds of thousands of babies each year. Let us ask ourselves about the honesty and truth in trying over and over again to grow out of our national debt by creating artificial GDP growth and tax revenue growth, by simply creating inflation, which deprives especially the so-called small savers society of their hard-earned possession, and thus makes them dependent on the welfare state. We could also question the OECD standards for accounting for the unemployment figures that simply reduce the real figures by statistical tricks, so that the publicized figure, for example, in Austria, which was for years below 5%, and everyone knew it's not true. Just recently, at least we came up with the official figure to 7.9, which means close to 8%. But if you talk to the experts, they would immediately tell you, well, if you're asking for the real people who are in the employment age and who are without employment, the real figure is between 12 and 14%. So how comes? I mean, there is a lot of tricks. The OECD is applying tricks, and in Austria we're applying other tricks, such as, for example, early retirement. Send people into retirement way before the retirement age. Our retirement age is 65, the official age, but the effective age is 58. So the average of the Austrians retiring is at 58 instead of 65. Or seminar systems for unemployed people. If you are on unemployment benefits, but you agree to attend a seminar, whoops, you're out of statistics. Or so-called sick leave. If you just announce to the unemployment agency, and you're not losing any money or any benefits with it, that you're on sick leave, whoops, you are out of the unemployment statistics. Or all the people who are over the time that they can be within the unemployment, on the unemployment benefits, they will be changed without any heavy losses into emergency benefits. Again, they are out of the unemployment statistics. So there is a lot from many different angles that is just simply not true within our society and in our public policy debate. I'm very happy that I don't know much about Slovakia, so I cannot complain about anything that is going on here. But maybe you find that some of the things that I'm saying are also true for Slovakia. I don't know. But now, a very brief flashlight about the economy, because I had the feeling during some of the questions before that we think that the economy is something outside the sphere of our normal society. Some strange and dangerous beast that we need to be careful about. But that's not true, as I just said. The economy is part of our human society, and even bringing about the best of human nature by building upon free decisions based on truth, reliability, mutual trust, and the exchange of information. It is the best system of growing wealth within a society, and thus also supporting the very nucleus of this society, our families. But as I just said, many people are afraid of the free market economy. They think we need to bind it, tame it, control it, regulate it, and finally make this system dependent on political decision-making processes. Because in the view of those people, politicians know better what is best for man than the individual decision-making of the people. These people tend to keep the word democracy in their mouth, but then they are afraid of the most democratic of all institutions, and that is, in fact, the free market system. That does not mean, on the other hand, that we should be opposed to legislation and regulations that create a transparent system of equal opportunities for everyone, and thus equality before the law, but not financial equality or equality of talents or abilities. This can never be achieved, because if we really want to have the total equality of everyone, then we need to cut off the legs of Usain Bolt, for example, because Usain Bolt is, as far as I know, 10 times Olympic champion, the fastest runner in the world, and he's earning millions and millions with his talent of running faster than anyone else, which is unfair. It's not equal. I cannot even run a tenth of his time, you know? So let's cut off his legs so that we are on equal level. That's stupid. So what does the church say about the free market economy? Pope Benedict XVI refers to the free economy in his encyclical Caritas in Veritate by saying, the church, quote, the church has always held that economic action is not to be regarded as something opposed to society. Economy and finance as instruments can be used badly when those at the helm are motivated by pure selfish ends. Instruments, he says, that are good in themselves can thereby be transformed into harmful ones. Therefore, it is not the instrument that must be called to account, but individuals, their moral conscience, and their personal and social responsibility. And he keeps on saying, every economic decision has a moral consequence. So obviously it's about morals. Our set of moral values, of attitudes, the virtues that prevail within a society, that guarantee the flourishing of this society, and as an integral part of this society, its economy. But where do we find the one, quote, most humanizing institution of our society? The best school of virtues, the most distinguished institution that teaches us mutually beneficial team play based on values such as honesty, reliability, trust, responsibility, modesty, cooperation, solidarity. Where do we find this school that teaches us all these values? Well, obviously, that is the family. So at this point, we should already realize why the family is of utmost importance, whether we like it or not, whether we are married or not, but it is of utmost importance for the healthy progress within our society. So again, to condense it even further, what is the family? There was a conference last weekend in Rome at the Vatican. The conference was called Humanum. The Humanum conference brought together scientists from all around the world at the Vatican to talk about the family. And there was one lecture given by someone that I find tremendously impressive, one of the smartest people on this planet. And I took the liberty to ask Pavel to have a couple of copies prepared for you about this one lecture that this gentleman gave in Rome, and they're at the entrance table, so you can get a copy of that. The gentleman that gave this lecture is the famous moral philosopher, Professor Lord Jonathan Sacks. He is the former chief rabbi of the United Kingdom. And he started his lecture by talking about science and religion. He says, quote, "Science takes things apart in order to see how they work. Religion puts things together in order to see what they mean." And then he continues, that's also a way to think about culture. Does it put things together, or does it take things apart? And then he goes on, what made the traditional family remarkable? A work of high religious art. This is what it brought together. Sexual drive, physical desire, friendship, companionship, emotional kindship and love, the begetting of children and their protection and care, their early education and induction into an identity and a history. And then he says, seldom has any institution woven together so many different drives and desires, roles and responsibilities. It made sense of the world and gave it a human face, the face of love. He goes on, for a whole variety of reasons, some to do with medical developments like birth control, in vitro fertilization and other genetic interventions, some to do with moral change, like the idea that we are free to do whatever we like, so long as it does not harm others, some to do with the transfer of responsibilities from the individual to the state, welfare state, and other and more profound changes in the culture of the West. Almost everything, he says, due to these reasons, almost everything that marriage once brought together has now been split apart. Sex has been divorced from love, love from commitment, marriage from having children, and having children from responsibility for their care. The result is, he says, that in Britain, Great Britain, in 2012, 47.5% of children were born outside marriage, expected to become a majority in 2016, 2 years from now. Fewer people are marrying, and those who are marrying later. Look at me. And 42% of marriages end in divorce. Well, I'm not there yet, at least. Nor is cohabitation, he says, a substitute for marriage. The average length of cohabitation in Britain and the United States is less than 2 years. The result, he says, is a sharp increase among young people of eating disorders, drug abuse and alcohol abuse, stress-related syndromes, depression, and actual and attempted suicide. The collapse of marriage has created a new form of poverty concentrated among single-parent families. And of these, the main burden is borne by women, who in 2011 headed 92% of single-parent households. In Britain today, more than 1 million children will grow up with no contact whatsoever with their fathers. He says this is creating a divide within societies, the like of which has not been seen since Disraeli spoke of 2 nations a century and a half ago. Those who are privileged, he says, to grow up in stable, loving associations with the 2 people who brought them into being, on average will be healthier physically and emotionally. They will do better at school and at work. They will have more successful relationships, be happier, and live longer. And yes, there are many exceptions. But the injustice of it all cries out to heaven, he says. It will go down in history as one of the tragic instances of what Friedrich August von Hayek, the economic Nobel laureate from Austria, called the fatal conceit that somehow we know better than the wisdom of ages, and that we can defy the lessons of biology and history. And he ends by saying, but our compassion for those who choose to live differently should not inhibit us from being advocates for the, quote, the single most humanizing institution in history. The family, man, woman, and child is not one lifestyle choice among many. It is the best means we have yet discovered for nurturing future generations and enabling children to grow in a matrix of stability and love. It is where we learn the delicate choreography of relationship and how to handle the inevitable conflicts within any human group, sports group, work team, whatever. It is where we first take the risk of giving and receiving love. It is where one generation passes on its values to the next, ensuring the continuity of a civilization. For any society, the family is the crucible of its future. And for the sake of our children's future, we must be its defenders. I would really urge you to read the whole lecture because it's a lot more than what I've just quoted. And it's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard about families. But now we've been talking a lot about virtues. So just give me 1 minute because the concept of virtues is important. And again, who would be surprised that the whole concept of virtues, the teaching of virtues, which was developed in ancient Greece, by the way, and remains relevant for us until today, which was integrated into Catholic social teaching during the medieval scholastic period and became known to us as cardinal virtues. That was again a family achievement. It was a very famous father who sat down and wrote a book that should be a lasting educative guide for his beloved son. How his son could end up leading a healthy and fulfilled life as a valuable part of society. The name of the father was Aristotle. The name of the son was Nicomachus, and the book is called the Ethica Nicomacheia, the Nicomachean Ethics. And I really also recommend to all of you to read this book. In this book, he talks about a set of values, especially the values of prudence, justice, courage, and moderation. And he says to his son, these values needs to become your ethos, which is nothing else than your habitual behavior. You need to train these virtues every day until you revert to them automatically in your day-to-day life, without even thinking about them. Become your habitual behavior. Okay, and now from whatever we have said about the family, now let's move a little bit the perspective over to economics. I want to talk with you about the demographic dividend. Maybe you have never heard about that before. I've read it in the very recently released population report of the United Nations, the population report for 2014. Healthy families and stable families within our society are important for emotionally and physically stable as well as well-educated and morally firm children and young generation. And the UN World Population Report, based on research from David Bloom, Department of Global Health and Population at the Harvard University, talks about the demographic dividend. And the demographic dividend is the economic growth potential that can result from shifts in a population's age structure, when the share of the working age population is larger than the non-working age share of the population. And the United Nations say that the potential can be enormous, provided supportive economic policies are in place and investments in human capital, particularly of young people, are substantial and strategic. They also revert to a World Bank research from the year 2013, where the World Bank talks a little bit about this environment in which this population dividend can prosper. They say good policies and governance are important for creating a business-friendly environment, for expanding job opportunities in the formal sector. Labor laws need to be flexible enough to encourage firms to expand and create jobs. The requirements for setting up a business, meeting regulatory requirements, and paying taxes need to be transparent and easy to manage. Regulation should be enforceable without extensive delays or opacity. Slow processing by bureaucracies, corruption, and above all randomness in processing can be very discouraging for business because it greatly increases the effort and costs of doing business. Such costs are the most discouraging for small companies. Predictability is of the essence for a business-friendly environment, whether it is power availability or regulations. And within this environment, the population dividend can bring its best returns. But now, look at our European societies. The demographic dividend already reversed. After 1945, life expectancy in Western Europe increased dramatically, from 62 years in 1950 to almost 79 years in 2003, with further growing tendencies. At the same time, the number of newborn babies decreased significantly. The normal replacement level, as we've just heard, is 2.1, just to sustain the current society. And we can see what the fertility rates, and that was talked about already before, is doing in our countries right now. It is dropping dramatically. The World Bank in 2011 suggested that the European Union will lose almost 40 million workers over the next 50 years. This is 18% of our current workforce. In the late 1930s, Lord John Maynard Keynes, and I don't quote Keynes very often, but here it is important, he argued that population growth helped create demand and thereby fuel prosperity, while conversely, declining population will make it immensely more difficult than before to maintain prosperity. The famous Italian economist Ettore Gotti Tedeschi, he was once the CEO of the Vatican Bank, he stated that shrinking and aging European population imply not only reduced demand, but also higher tax burdens on those who are young and working. The resulting shrinkage of disposable income discourages those of childbearing years from having more children. And the famous German economist Hans Werner Sinn, he argues that we can see a direct link between the invention of a socialized pay-as-you-go pension scheme in Germany in already 1889 under Bismarck, but then really developed in the 1950s and 60s, and soon after in basically all European countries, which socialized, he says, the productivity of children away from their parents towards the whole of society, and thus disconnecting the link between children caring for their parents at old age. The same children will now also pay for the many other people who never had children. So thank you very much, by the way, for every one of you who has children, because they will once be paying my pension. Maybe not because I'm not living in Slovakia, but on the European level they will. Hans Werner Sinn, thank you. Hans Werner Sinn goes on saying that today no young couple would even make their retirement care part of their considerations of having children at all, even though it is effectively those children that will finally pay for their pensions nevertheless. And he concludes by saying, if you really want to bring down fertility rates, you might go for a strict one-child policy like in China, where the fertility rate is 1.66. But he says even more effective is a modern pay-as-you-go pension scheme like in Europe. So what are the main reasons for the falling fertility rates in Europe? There are several reasons, obviously. One is the higher labor force participation by women. Obviously, if women want to work full-time, then they have less time to have and to care for children. It's easier access to contraception. It's legalization of abortion. It's, strange enough, lower infant mortality, because if the infant mortality decreases, also the willingness of having more children decreases. But then, foremost, it is the influences of the modern welfare states. In 2005, a study shows that almost all states with large pension systems have fertility rates below replacement levels, no matter where you look in the world. A 2007 analysis in 50 states all around the globe of fertility rates, pensions, and other variables indicated that higher social security contributions and other pension taxes had a significant effect, negative effect obviously, on fertility rates. Previously, children had to care for their aging parents, which had raised and cared for them while they had been young. With our modern pay-as-you-go public pension schemes, these links of mutual dependencies and solidarity have been gradually broken, thus leading also to another ethical decline regarding family ties and responsibilities. As the population ages, we see declines in private and public savings. The pace of economic growth subsequently weakens. A declining economic growth rate makes pensions harder to provide. This leads to higher taxation, which reduces the income of those who are working. They in return respond by having fewer children, which makes the problem even worse. By the way, if I get too long, get me some nice, charming sign like I should cut off. Okay, the welfare state. The welfare state, strong government intervention, and the build-up of this welfare state comes at a huge cost. First, and we have already mentioned that, it comes at the cost of a breakdown in solidarity. Solidarity will be reduced to the welfare state, taking money from some and giving it to others. The whole discussion about a wealth tax in Austria and in Germany, but also the already existing 75% tax in France that made many wealthy people flee the country. Most prominently, the famous actor Gérard Depardieu, who chose to become a Russian citizen instead, of all places. Or recently, the lifting of banking secrecy in Greece and automatic reporting of deposits over 100,000 euros to the tax authorities. Or the very recent accusations against Luxembourg and its former prime minister and current new head of the EU Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker. I'm not a big fan of Jean-Claude Juncker, don't get me wrong. But here, what are we talking about? This is, excuse my French, it's rubbish what is talked about in the media. We do not need less, but more tax competition. I don't need Luxembourg to be banned from having low tax rates. I need more countries like Luxembourg to have very low tax rates. Because exactly this tax competition, like any competition anywhere on this planet, will lead to urgently needed lowering of tax rates, lowering of wealth redistribution, and thus see Europe get back on a growth path. Second negative effect of the welfare state, it's the gradual dulling of productivity. European welfare states have created strong incentives not to work. The World Bank stated in a report on European economies that work incentives are weaker in Europe. For example, in 2010, French employees worked an average of 620 hours. Germans worked already 700 hours, and the Americans worked 870 hours. Another negative aspect, growing obstacles to reform. sclerotic politics, heavily dependent on their constituencies that they had purchased with social benefits in the first place, need to find new ways to finance the ever-growing welfare state and welfare demands. Done via increasing taxation, this sucks further funds out of the economy's wealth-producing sectors. And this further decreases growth and productivity and thus weakens the government's ability to sustain such spending. Maybe I can just briefly enlighten you. Well, here is another chart showing the aging societies, the group of the retired people compared to a group of 100 people in the active workforce. You see in 2015, let's take Germany, you had 32.7 retired people compared to 100 in the active workforce. And in 2060, the same ratio goes up to 67.1. So really our societies are aging dramatically. Here is the absolute growth or decline of populations by regions. So you can see which societies are growing and which societies are declining. And always remember what the United Nations told us about the population dividend. A growing society with a lot of young kids is that society that will see prosperity. A shrinking society will see decline. And now I ask yourself, what do you think international big corporations, where are they going to invest? Where are they going to start new firms? In a shrinking population, with shrinking consumers, with shrinking workers, with shrinking innovation, or in a growing society? Thank you very much. Europe will be closed. Marriage and divorce rates, we have been talking about that already. In Austria, which is right in the middle of this chart, every second marriage gets divorced, and it's getting worse. Percentage of birth to unmarried women between 1980 and 2007. You see how the figure of children born to unmarried women is exploding. But actually what I wanted to show, well, the family structure of families in poverty. The single-parent families are the vast majority. 90% of those families in poverty are those of single-parent families, or in other words, of non-families, of single-parenting parents. This is a brief chart, but maybe before we get to this, I wanted to show you that. Because I just mentioned the tax burden that is growing to unsustainable levels and the dulling of productivity. On the lower end of this paper, you see the growth on the left column, the growth of spending, government spending, as share of GDP. And on the right chart, you see the corresponding development of economic growth. And you can see a direct link. The more the government starts to spend, in other words, the higher the taxes need to be that are taken out of the productive sector of the economy, going through the wheels of bureaucracy and being trickled back after some time into the same economy, the more this redistribution takes place, the less productivity and economic growth you will see. It's very easy. The tax burden is growing already to unsustainable levels. In 1997, there was a report of the Kiel Institute of World Economy that said, back then we didn't have the euro, obviously, it was still Deutschmark, but this report said that for each Deutschmark that is taxed out of the productive economy, trickled through bureaucracy, coming back at some point due to whatever subsidies or whatever, back into the economy to the consumers, 50% of its purchasing power was lost on its way through bureaucracy. Calculations show that a further increase in taxes for 1% would reduce GDP growth for 1.8%. and employment would be reduced for 1.14%. A study of the American Economic Review showed that each US dollar paid to the government would bring about a loss for the economy of 33.2%, 33.2 cents. Another study of the American Sociological Review talks about a reduction in GDP growth of 2.8% over 3 years, or roughly 1% per year for each additional dollar that is taxed from an average household. I mean, so you see the tremendous negative effects of taxation. But then the last point, and this is most frightening, should be most frightening for us if we're talking about the welfare state, is the ethical deterioration of people living within a welfare society. Can the welfare state support a culture of virtues and ethical acting individuals? Or is it rather undermining the ethical base of its subjects? I mean, if I go back and if I look at the divorce rates or at this rate, then I'm asking myself, are we developing into the right direction? Karen Horn, she's currently the president of the Hayek Foundation Germany. She published a commentary some years ago in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung talking about the fading ethical values within a welfare state society. Horn talks about changes in mentality of the people caused by the welfare state because private initiatives, self-responsibilities, work ethics, and all of that are deteriorating. If the state distributes a lot of funds, many people will wake up and claim their part. So that creates negative desires and supports cheating and therefore criminal practices. Okay, that's a very general statement, you could say. But then Assar Lindbeck, he's a member of the Swedish Nobel Prize Committee. He wrote that any modern society builds its system upon following social norms. You shall not steal, you shall not commit fraud, pay your taxes properly, and only receive those transfer payments that you are entitled to. But the more developed the welfare state is, the more it supports its citizens to offend those principles due to rising opportunity costs of ethical behavior by rising transfer payments. Lindbeck's thesis says the growing social welfare state destroys the ethical norms and morals of its people. And then there is Friedrich Heinemann from the Center of European Economic Research, who confirms this very thesis with his empirical research. The growing welfare state led ultimately to a diminishing morality amongst society. The more transfer payments are available within the system, he says, the lower the moral standards to act properly. Figures show that the elder generation, being brought up before the development of our modern welfare states, has higher standards than the younger generation. The higher unemployment, the lower are the moral standards, he says. And yeah, I'm ready in 1 minute. I just need 1 minute. There is the last thing that I want to say about the government debt, high taxation, on the other side, low growth and economic stagnation relationship. Increased government spending, which comes automatically due to an ever-expanding welfare state and or due to a shrinking and aging population. We see both phenomena in Europe. The welfare state is rising, we were talking about that before, and the population is shrinking. So automatically government spending goes up. It increases also the overall government debt. Even so, tax revenues are growing considerably as well. Ample evidence and scientific research show that there is a direct connection between rising government debt and shrinking economic growth, as we have just seen on this chart. The IMF, International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, renowned economists such as Carmen Reinhardt or Kenneth Rogoff, everyone could show that the higher the debt to GDP ratio, The higher the government expenses will go, the lower economic growth will be. That means the lower growing wealth will be, which has a direct effect on our families and our society. In 2007, the German member of the ECB, the European Central Bank, the ECB Council, and the ECB chief economist Jürgen Stark explicitly expressed his concerns regarding a further deepening of the welfare state and, as he calls it, the social Europe, by saying that this strong social Europe can only be maintained through very high levels of taxation and public spending. Unfortunately, he says, there are increasing signs that such high levels of spending have detrimental medium and long-term economic effects, especially on growth and fiscal sustainability. Europeans need to decide, he says, whether their economies would become dinosaurs in the future. Avoidance of such a fate, he insisted, meant aiming to reduce public spending to something between 30 to 36% of GDP. Now you see where we are right now in Europe. We are above 53%. And again, I like to quote John Maynard Keynes, the father of government spending, by the way, Keynesianomics. He said in a correspondence with the British-Australian economist Colin W. Clark, he said, a figure of 25% of GDP is the maximum tolerable proportion of taxation that can be sustainable for a healthy economy. So you see we are way above that. We are more than double. Here you see a chart that shows you if an entrepreneur wants his employee to earn a net of €1 at the end of the month, how much he has to pay in total. Slovakia is not that bad, actually. If you want one of your employees to earn €1 net, you just have to pay €1.75. But unfortunately, there is a bad information in this chart. This is just the net that you're receiving. But all the consumption taxes, the VAT taxes, the gasoline taxes are not included, because if you go buy stuff, whatever it is, buy a car, buy a television, put gasoline into your tank, then the VAT and all other consumption taxes go off this 1%. So in other words, in order for having a real net purchasing power of 70 cents here in Slovakia, an entrepreneur needs to pay 1.75 euros. This is the reality. But be happy, because in Austria it's way more. It's 2.11, and in Belgium it's 2.34. So you see, very briefly, negative development of GDP growth over the last couple of years. You see the deficit as GDP, or total government debt of GDP, and you see the Maastricht criteria. You see how many of us are breaking simply the European treaties already. No one cares about the European Treaty of Maastricht anymore. This is a very important chart, because you could argue, well, but I mean, government regulation, government taxation, still it helps the poor to a certain extent, blah, 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 blah. I doubt that. We can discuss it later if you have questions. But there was an institute in America, actually it's a hedge fund. They calculated how much would be the total volume of the economy in the United States today if we would go back to the level of regulation of 1949. If you would reduce all the laws and regulations that are put on the economy back to the level of 1949. Today, the total economy is $15.1 trillion. It could be $53.9 trillion if you would just simply reduce the regulation to the level of 1949. And I don't think that 1949 was a robber baron year in the United States. Do you think so? I mean, that was a developed country, had enough regulation for everyone to have a decent life. And this is just some ideas for the discussion, and I leave you with that. I will not elaborate on that. Some of my ideas in order to support families and children based on some of the things that I just said, and I leave that to your consideration and to the discussion. Thank you very much for your patience with my long lecture.